Today, my guest is in the middle of a varied and successful career. He has won the Ralph J. Gleason Award for Best Music Book. He was nominated for a Grammy in 2003. He was named Literary Artist of 2013 for Rockland County, New York. He produced a documentary about Hurricane Katrina, and to my knowledge, he's written at least 10 books about all different kinds of subjects, including a forthcoming book of poems called The Names of Birds, which I really look forward to asking him about during today's show. In 2009, he wrote what has turned out to be one of my favorite books about how kids learn what they need to know. If you want to read something that will help you make decisions every day about your child's education, you need this book, How Lincoln Learned to Read. I'm so excited today because I get to interview this book's author. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Daniel Wolff.
What an intro. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Welcome, welcome. So in rereading the book recently, I really got goosebumps from the prologue and the epilogue. And if it's okay with you, I'd love to read a couple of sentences because they just set up the purpose of the whole book.
Sure.
All right. So you start off with, say we start at the founding of the Republic and pick an American who helps define how we think of ourselves, helps define what and how we've learned. Ask the question, what part of your education was useful and what not? Maybe these stories will also build on each other and form a kind of history. How we've defined and redefined knowledge. How we've decided who should have access to which knowledge and why. How we've tried to perpetuate it, to pass it on. How do we learn what we need to know? So that's the prologue. And now I'm going to actually go to the book, which I'm sure you'll hear like the pages of the book. The part that just really just hit home for me was this at the end. The story that all these stories tell is of people trying to find their way to knowledge, trying to find what they'll need to know. We add our history to the ones we've already heard, and then we come back to the question of how to prepare for the future. We listen for what's next. That sound in the distance, kids' voices. Imagine a playground at dusk. It makes you think, like, what do you need to know and how do you learn it? Would you say that that's the point of the book?
Oh, absolutely. And the playground at dusk is maybe poeticized a little, but actual. When my kids were growing up, we would meet this group of parents who were concerned about the public schools in the playground behind the school when everybody else had left and kind of talk through what was happening to our kids and what were they learning and why and what were we supposed to do. So some of it is just, reporting.
Yeah. Interestingly, I'm getting an echo now. Are you getting an echo?
No, I don't hear an echo.
Okay. Well, now it's gone. Maybe it was this little Skype thing.
All right.
So,
your husband's in charge.
I know. And he it's funny, as I set this up on a Sunday and he is off playing laser tag with our boys. So that was my question. Was going to be my question. How old are your kids?
My kids now are not kids.
They're adults.
Yeah. One is 28 and one is 25. Yeah. And I was thinking about before, as I was getting ready for this interview, I was thinking about it. They're both freelancers. The eldest one is an actor, and the young one is a musician and a record producer. And since I'm a freelancer, I wondered if that sort of biased me in terms of this book and in terms of what I think about education. But I also realized, talking to 20 and 30-year-olds, that lots and lots of people are freelancers now. That the era when public education knew what you were going to do as a grown-up and therefore could prepare you to work on Henry Ford's assembly line or whatever it was, are really gone.
Yeah, that era is over.
That era is over. And lots of kids, yours will be hitting it soon, sort of have to improvise. It's a skill they better learn how to do, because there's not a job for the rest of your life probably with a guaranteed income.
Yeah, I would say that is gone. I think my husband has one of the last vested pensions in the country.
There you go. Good for him.
Yeah, exactly. And yet we still worry. We still almost don't trust it because you hear about like Enron and other things like that. One of the most, I think, scariest things for us in these last years where I've had this autoimmune disorder has been, what if his job goes south and then he doesn't have a job. I am pretty much unable to work. And what do we do then? But I think we're feeling a little bit more hopeful because of this kind of freelancing life that homeschooling really is.
I guess the question I'm asking is, how do you, if part of what education is about is trying to prepare your kids for the future, it doesn't do any good to prepare them for a future that doesn't exist. You kind of, I don't know how you do this, but you kind of want them to know how to land on their feet when the pension disappears or whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you need to be able to help them kind of almost by backing away, I guess. I mean, I feel like one of the reasons I started this is because I see this particular podcast is because I see so many parents who just hover and they're like afraid to back away. They're afraid to let their kids fall down or be out of their sight on the playground for a minute. There's such a different mentality nowadays about what is safe and what is not safe. And because of that, I feel like we're just hovering over kids. We're afraid to let them be creative, make mistakes, fall down, screw up. And
well, one of the interesting things for me about this book was, since it goes from Ben Franklin through Elvis Presley and sort of looks at all of their educations, that as the sort of country got civilized and the frontier disappeared, you began to get this kind of regimented feel of, okay, now we know what we're doing and we can prepare our kids for it. And, whether it was getting them ready to work in the cotton mills outside of Boston or, getting them ready to work again at Henry Ford's assembly line, you had a sense that, okay, we know what the jobs are and so on.
Yeah.
Right now is much more like the beginning of the country in a way.
Yes.
Which is that you kind of go, I don't know what's going to happen. We're entering a new world. What kind of basic skills do you need?
Yeah.
I'm sympathetic with parents hovering over their kids only because I think it comes out of fear.
Yeah. I'm very sympathetic as well. I don't mean to belittle this. I did it. I mean, it's so hard not to. It's scary.
Right. And they're right to be scared. That is that there are no guarantees. And there was a time there in the sort of middle of the 20th century when people thought they had a guarantee.
Yes.
There was a good job out there for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And you get like disapproval if you, from parents, for instance. Like I have a brother who was incredibly smart. And I feel like my folks kind of spent some of their time when he was in his 20s thinking, God, he's wasting his life. Like he's just wasting his life. He could be doing so much. And, and he went his own way and he actually, he's got a great life and it's quite conventional. In that he goes to a job every day and he's very happily married and that kind of thing. But I think when he was younger and they were just like, how is he going to turn out? He's never going to, he's got such gifts and he's not using them, kind of a thing.
Right.
So our podcast is organized into 4 themes. And what I love about your book is that it could fit in any one. We got unplanned adventures, which makes me think of my autoimmune disorder as an unplanned adventure. And I have learned a lot from it. And in your book, I think of Helen Keller. That was an unplanned adventure and she learned a lot from her adventure, right? Of not being able to see or hear or speak.
Absolutely.
Risky business, which is about kind of taking risks, kind of going out on your own or trying to be creative in some way, which I actually kind of think of John F. Kennedy because he was such he got into trouble at school. He was a troublemaker, and he just never did what his parents wanted him to do. That was my impression. I haven't reread that chapter recently. Am I right on that?
No, I think that's right. I think he was kind of rich and bored was part of it.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think for him, if you didn't have risky business, it was business as usual, and he didn't want that. Yeah,
that was not happening for him, definitely. And then we have kids through the ages, which I think of in 2 ways as developmental milestones. So parents can. I have actually already had an early intervention therapist on, and I'm hoping to talk to some other just educators about milestones in a child's development. But the other thing about kids through the ages is I think it could be kids in history. Like imagining Ben Franklin at 10 years old taking a tour of Boston with his dad.
Right.
And then the fourth one, is the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. And that one, again, it could be so many of them, but the ones that really spoke to for me were Ben Franklin and Rachel Carson. And I wondered if maybe I could ask you to start with Ben and then move on to Rachel, kind of sharing with our listeners about their childhoods and how their upbringings influenced their interaction with literacy and their ideas about the written word.
Sure. Ben Franklin was the place to start this book because he's a founding father, as we say, but also because in a lot of ways he set the model for, I think, how Americans think about education, which is in a complicated way, I think, in that at the same time that we value learning and think it's important to know something, we don't really trust it. Mm-hmm. So if you're Bill Clinton and you have a Rhodes Scholarship or whatever he got and, are an educated man, the way to get elected is to be all homey and folky. Mm-hmm. I'm just Bill Clinton from Arkansas, and the master of this was Abraham Lincoln, who was an educated lawyer and, liked to tell dirty stories because then he was just a regular guy. Apparently he had the greatest dirty stories of anyone. So I hear that, of course, that none of them are written down, so it's a little hard to confirm that. But so Ben Franklin, growing up, he was the 10th kid in a big family in Boston. This is obviously before the United States of America is America. It's a colony. And his father is a tradesperson who is making candles and soap in the house. And Ben's going to be the educated kid because he can read really quickly. And he says he can't remember, in his autobiography, he can't remember when he couldn't read.
That's right.
And what I sort of get from that is he was in a household where everyone else was reading, and he sort of absorbed it by osmosis. It just came to him. So that, that was his parents' signal that, okay, this is the kid who's going to go far and be a bigwig.
Yeah.
And what... excuse me, 1 second. I have to let a cat in the door.
Oh, it's all right.
There we go.
And they wanted him to be a minister. They had him picked out for the ministry, right? To be a minister.
Yeah, the route in those days was you went to Boston Latin, which is the elementary school, and then you went to Harvard, and something like half or more of the people who graduated from Harvard ended up ministers. Mm-hmm. And it was, building on your theme, it was the joke was it was reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. Mm-hmm. They were all entwined, and he, it's very interesting writing this book and thinking about the education of people because it tends to be what you skip over in a biography. They want to get to when the guy or the gal becomes famous, but you read this stuff, and Franklin, in almost an aside in his autobiography, says he did 1 year in this elementary school and then left. And you kind of go, what do you mean you left, Ben? What was that about? And all he'll say is that he was a leader, and he doesn't say troublemaker, but you get the feeling that he didn't get along with either his teachers or his fellow students. It's not clear.
Yeah.
But so he lasted a year and then spent another year in what was called a reading school, where he learned how to read and write again, and that was all his formal schooling. Mm-hmm. So from then on, it was him, what he called a self-education. And again, I think as Americans, not just because of Ben Franklin, but also because of how we pioneered the country and had to sort of invent ourselves, that's what we value, is self-education. We think in a lot of ways that's the thing that we go, yeah, that proves you're really, a man or a woman, is that you didn't just copy down what somebody else said, you educated yourself.
Yeah.
And I confess I share those values, and I think, I owe some of them to Franklin probably.
Yeah, going your own way, kind of.
Yeah. So he then went on, I'll try to do this quickly because you can read the book if you want to. But, he then, the main mode of education at the time was to work for an artisan and learn a trade. And you signed up typically for, I think it was 7 or 8 years. And you essentially belonged to this person, whether it was a silversmith or a rope maker or
boot
maker or something like that. Right, exactly. And he tried, I think he did a guy who made knives, and he did it for about 3 days and said, I can't stand this either. And as you mentioned earlier, his father kind of took him on a tour of Boston, saying, look at all these things people do to make a living. And in those days and age, of course, it was mostly...
And can you just, how old was he? Sorry to interrupt, but how old was he when he was on this tour? He was 10, right?
He was 10,
with his dad.
So he was making a career choice then, and that was typical. I mean, it wasn't special. You kind of got told what to do at a young age. What was atypical was he was in on the process. He got to have a say in the decision.
He could say no thanks, or well, didn't he kind of get cajoled into being an apprentice to his brother?
Yeah, exactly. His brother was a printer, and after this series of dropping out of schools and not working at the knife guy, his father essentially said, "You're going to go work for your brother now, and you'll come out a printer." He wanted to be a sailor, Ben Franklin.
That's right.
And for me, that's if you want to go ship out, it's really saying, get me out of here. I want my freedom, as much as I love the ocean. It's like the romantic escape. And he wasn't going to be allowed to do that. So he went and worked for his brother. And printing in those days was not only making the ink and setting the paper and working the presses, but you often were responsible for the content. You actually wrote the articles. So the kind of reporter, printer were the same hat.
Yeah.
And so Franklin started doing that and taught himself how to write in order to be able to be a printer. And, it sounds, I bet, to your listeners like long ago and far away. I think one of the theses of the book is we all do that in a way. The cliche is you find your passion, but whatever it is you're interested in, if you're lucky and work at it, you figure out how to do it. It helps to have teachers and people who've done it before, but you don't get there just by kind of getting in line and being inoculated. That's why I think these stories are still pertinent, is that what Franklin said was, I got to be a good writer. I got to be able to persuade people. I've got to be able to take apart an argument and explain it to someone. And he just set out to do it. He'd read, recommended essays and say, how did this person do this? And would then often try to rewrite the essay in his own language to figure out if he really understood it. And it was, for Henry Ford, the story I always liked was he would go out on Sundays when everybody else was in church and the machines were abandoned in the farm fields, and he'd take apart a farmer's machine, betting he could get it back together before they were out of church. And awesome. In that way would learn about machinery.
Yeah.
And Ben Franklin essentially did the same thing, which is he took apart people's writing to try to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
And became very good at it.
And one of the things that I love that he did, and I feel like this is really relevant to certainly my youngest would, I guess, so I'll go back. What I love that Ben Franklin did was he started to, if he was mad or annoyed about his situation, he tried to kind of influence it with like he would make pamphlets written by, or letters, right? Written by the widow Silence Dogood. And he did such a good job of sounding like a widow with these particular sort of situations with her. She had a son that she was thinking about sending to Boston Latin, and she, I feel like that was the one where she sort of dreamed that he's able to really make fun of all of these institutions that bug the crap out of him, right. through his writings. And I think about especially my younger son, because all through his life, he was the kid who I'd say, if you say poopy one more time, you are in big trouble. And he'd go, okay, Mom, I won't say poopy anymore. He just, he'd turn it back on itself. And I feel like that was the kind of thing that I thought Ben Franklin was doing as well.
Well, and it's often hard to find, I think, in, writing about education and about child rearing, how important fun is. That you actually have fun doing it, and how important it is that it be funny as well, that there be some humor to it. And if I picked out these people who got famous and are well known, But when they talk about their education, that tends to be what they remember. You know, Elvis Presley just loved singing. It was his idea of heaven to be able to sing, and you couldn't steer him away from it.
Yeah.
Well, you know, once he got a taste of it. And I think the trouble often we find in organized education is that they're busy trying to steer you away from that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not your agenda, it's their agenda.
Exactly. And if what you really want to do is watercolor, they go, well, that's good. We have an art class once a week for 45 minutes and you can do it. You know, it's killing the kid.
Yeah.
Not to be able to do more. I am sympathetic. It's hard to impossible to organize a school where everybody got to watercolor as much as they wanted. At the same time, I think we lose sight of the fact that really is how we learn what we need to know.
Yeah.
Is through the fun of it and the passion for it and the giggling that goes along with it.
Yeah, so true. I think about, we started homeschooling because school made my oldest, we used to say that he was allergic to school. He kind of had post-traumatic stress syndrome. I won't really, the purpose of this isn't to talk about how great homeschooling is, but we did it because we wanted some creativity. We wanted them to be able to have a more of a say in how they kind of spent their days. And I feel like for kids who are in school, one of the things one of my goals for this podcast is, not everybody is enamored of homeschooling. Not everybody would do it even if they could. And there's got to be a way to help, for people who like what you can still do stuff with your kids outside of school, to help foster their creativity and that kind of stuff. And pardon me. What I love about just moving on a little bit to Rachel sure. Carson is that she and her mom would sort of say, okay, well, don't go to school today. That's all right. And they would stay home, and she would have kind of these complete opposite of school experiences out in the wilds and writing stories with her mom, and just a beautiful relationship, And yeah, I don't know, did you see it that way as well, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Her mom had been a school teacher until she got married. Back in those days, your listeners may not know this, you couldn't be married and be a school teacher. And
just a reminder, these days are what Rachel Carson was born in 1907, I feel like, 1903.
Yeah, that's right. It's the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And that had been true earlier as well. I mean, the theory was that if you had a husband and kids, that's where your duty lay, not teaching.
Yeah.
So once you got married, you weren't supposed to be in the schools anymore. So her mom got married and had 3 kids, Rachel being the youngest, and became what we'd now call a stay-at-home housewife. Mm-hmm. They didn't have much money or anything, but this interest in education and in learning stayed with her. And you don't unfortunately get Rachel Carson's mother's story because she didn't leave it. But clearly it was talk about fun. Her idea of fun was helping her kids, in Rachel's case, walk up the side of the mountain they lived on and discover birds' nests and be able to name them and be able to write about them, be able to draw them. And, if it meant missing school to do that, as a school teacher, she knew that this was more important.
Yeah. And then, sorry, go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and then it seems like what kind of happened for Rachel, and this, by the way, I guess if people don't know, this is Rachel Carson, the author of several books, just a passionate scientist and environmentalist, and a person who one of the books that she's most famous for is a book called Silent Spring, which is about like the poisoning of our environment by chemicals and pesticides and just the problems that come with. And I haven't read it, but I mean, it sounds like a real passionate plea for let's make this not happen anymore.
Yeah, it's mid 1960s. It was when John F. Kennedy was president, and people call it the beginning of the modern environmental movement because it was the first person who did the science, not only did the science, but then made a public plea that got people's attention and became a popular issue.
Yeah, and she died of breast cancer, right?
Right.
And which, I mean, it could be argued that she got that from her environment growing up. But I was thinking too about how, like, her mother really encouraged us, and she got such a great introduction to just the wilds and writing, the importance of both of those things, like our natural world and writing. And by the time she was in high school, she was really serious about being a good student. And it was almost like she needed those formative years of carefree, kind of very do what you want, like follow your own ideas about what education is. And then when she got older, she turned those into a real kind of juggernaut for national, political, environmental change.
Right. And she went on, I think part of her motivation, and people I'm sure know this is true, is that school was a way to get out. I mean, of the town she was in, of the limited circumstances that, looked like was going to be her future. In her town, which is, near Pittsburgh, very industrialized all around there, she was essentially going to work in a factory or be married to someone who worked in the factory of one kind or another. There were coal mines, there was aluminum factories, there was, energy plants and stuff there.
Oil refineries.
Exactly. So
are you there?
She had this very kind of limited future.
Rachel Carson, for her, I think writing was more of a means to an end in a way. I think her real passion was nature.
Mm-hmm.
And she realized that the way to kind of not only make that a career, she didn't think that as a kid, but to connect to it in a way that other people could share was to be able to write about it.
Yeah.
So, again, I think it's the pleasure and the passion that gets the kid first, and then, this other stuff becomes tools to get there. I mean, I could argue, and I kind of do in the book, that what Ben Franklin was really interested in was rebellion.
Yes.
And he didn't want to be a colony of England anymore, and he wanted to try to help that, and reading and writing seemed like a way towards it.
Yeah, and you can even see that with the widow Silence Dogood. I mean, he used her to start people talking, if not in a rebellious way, certainly in a what's the word, subversive kind of way. Right.
So, I think that maybe too often as parents we go, this kid has got to learn how to do their multiplication tables, and stop playing with the frogs, which seems to be their main interest.
Yeah.
But that in fact, if you let them run with the frogs some, and stay with the thing they care a lot, they realize, geez, I better learn multiplication tables if I'm going to figure out the science that'll help me get closer to frogs.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is.
That's so, and sorry, go ahead.
No, I just, I think it's often out of kind of wanting to protect our kids and guarantee them a future that we say, you've got to learn the multiplication tables. In fact, we're probably helping them more if we can get over our own hang-ups about it.
Yeah.
And let them pursue some of the stuff they really care about, because they'll eventually get to the thing that you think is so vital.
Yeah. So true. And I'm wondering, how did you, Daniel Wolff, learn what you needed to know? And I guess what did you find that you needed to know, and how did you learn it?
That's not fair. This book isn't about me.
If you don't mind.
I started to write as a young kid, and I would, be in the back of math class writing epic poems to myself instead of paying attention to math class. It really never occurred to me that it was a possibility of something to do with your life, because, writers were a whole different breed as far as I was concerned. But it was like I couldn't get over it. I kept wanting to do that. So I never studied it. I didn't go to writing class. I didn't do any of those things. I didn't get a degree in it or any of that. In fact, I kind of protected it from that in a lot of ways. Made sure that no one was trying to teach me it, because this was the stuff I wanted to learn on my own.
Wow. You almost kept it hidden.
Yeah. I shared the writing with people, but I don't even know quite how to say this. I didn't want to learn how other people did it. I wanted to learn how I wanted to.
It's almost like something welling up from inside you. You don't need somebody else to tell you how to do this. You just need the time and space to be able to really do it.
Yeah, and I think, I have friends who are really good cooks, and they they love cookbooks, and they love having a recipe, but as soon as they can, they're rolling on their own on this.
Yeah. You want to see what happens when you try that spice instead of this one, or
exactly,
whatever.
Exactly, and that's their kind of the fun again. The payoff is, well, what if I put mango in there, and suddenly they have a whole other dish. Well, that's sort of how I felt. I mean, and when it comes to writing, and in a lot of things, you learn from the people who have done it really well.
Mm-hmm.
And so
you study them?
Yeah, you read something and you go, geez, that's great. How did they do that?
Yeah.
It's Ben Franklin a little bit again. You take it apart and try to figure out I wasn't as disciplined as he was, but, you try to figure out how people did it. And that's true, I think, whether it's designing a car or a dress or whatever, you have some heroes and you try to figure out how they did it and how you can do it like them.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Did you now, actually, I wrote this question before I realized that your kids were pretty well grown by the time you had written this book. But my question was, did writing this book affect your parenting at all? And if not, because it seems to me like learning about your sort of career, you've written books on musicians, you've produced documentaries, you've done all these incredible things. Like did the doing of any of those things when the kids were young, did it affect your parenting at all?
Well,
does that make sense?
It makes sense. And I think it's a kind of two-way street. I mean, one thing is my wife is a choreographer and dancer, and so my kids saw two parents who were off pursuing the stuff they wanted to pursue. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a much bigger lesson than anything we could quote unquote teach. Because they sort of went, and other kids grow up, and I'm sure some of your listeners feel this way, and see their parents doing something they don't like. And they go, I hope I can figure out a way where that doesn't happen, where I get trapped, punching the clock from 9 to 5 in a way that
means that they can't spend time with me, kind of. I mean, it really, that's a lot of times with kids, it comes down to like I can remember when my 14-year-old was 5 and he was in kindergarten and they were having this big spring, this adorable like spring assembly, and they all dressed up. Their class was singing about hibernation, and my son dressed up as a bat, and he was just adorable. And when my husband, he had really high hopes, my husband had, of coming, and we didn't say to our son, it's probably likely that your dad won't be there. We somehow dropped that ball. And so I was there and his little brother was there, but his dad wasn't there. And he just folded up. I mean, what he took from that was my dad didn't have time. He couldn't get here. Like it almost doesn't matter why, but I think that planted the seed for him that long ago of like, there's no way I'm doing that.
Right.
I'm not missing important stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing, this may be of interest to, again, the people listening, with my oldest kid, who is now an actor and always wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. We in my memory is in kindergarten, it may have been first grade, he'd come home and his T-shirts were soaked in the front. And we'd try to figure out what this was about, and finally realized that he was so anxious in school he was chewing the front of his shirt. And so both of us said, well, let's do something else. And part of what we kept proposing to him was homeschooling. Mm-hmm. And said, how about this? Isn't this a solution to your problem? And he said, there's nobody else. If I learn at home, I can't do theater. And all this other stuff is worth it to me because they put on 2 plays a year at the school, and I can be in them. Yeah. And I know that there are parents whose kids, for example, are football players. And they may want to homeschool, but their kid really wants to have a team, and they can't. Yeah. They can't do it if they're homeschooling. So I think it ends up being a balance of that. And what you said earlier is really important, which is you do have from whatever it is, 3 in the afternoon until bedtime, where you can supplement whatever's going on. Yeah. So if for financial reasons or these other reasons you can't homeschool or you can't do that kind of thing.
Or Montessori or something, yeah.
Yeah, there are all these ways, it seems to me, that you can, enrich your kid's life. And there's yours, by the way. a lot more fun being a parent.
Oh, it is. It is. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, this is a little bit of an aside, but do you ever? So I guess I've had some times where I've been trying to explain to my kids something, or I've gotten a particular expression on my face, and I can see that from their expression, the way that I look is how like my mother looked when she was trying to explain whatever this thing was to me. And I feel this real kind of connection. I think it's so strange that you have to go through the youth before you get to the wisdom. I don't know. There's just something so weird about it. And it's like, in a way, I'm so looking forward to that for them, that when they're the parent, you know, or the uncle or whatever, that they will have this like, whoa moment.
Well, absolutely. And you can't get that until you do it. I mean, talk about experiential education. Until you experience having a kid, you don't realize what your parents went through.
Yeah.
To make it work.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So true.
I don't know if this is useful or not, but part of my sort of conclusion after, I don't know, I think my kids were sort of in middle school, which is a difficult time, as we say.
Yep.
I realized that really what I wanted to be was their grandparent.
Yes.
That the ideal parenting would be that kind of, you know how grandparents just love their grandkids and let them do what they want and don't worry the same way parents do about if they're all going to work out. Are they going to get what they want? And I never really got there. But part of me thought, you know, the way to do this is just to treat them like grandchildren. They're these...
Oh, that's a great idea.
They're these special kids, and they're going to be fine. You've lived long enough to realize they're going to make it. They'll do fine. Let them pursue what they want to pursue.
I love that. So listeners, think of them as your grandchildren. That is the best piece of advice I think I've ever heard about parenting, because you spend, when they're little, I mean, you just, every time, you know, they fall down or get their feelings hurt, or, you know, you can see something in them that they can't see themselves. And it's just so hard to pull yourself out of that. But if you envision yourself as their grandparent, you could do it.
Yeah.
I think that's really cool. That's neat. I have to confess, I'm shifting subjects a little bit, but I've never been a lover of poetry. I mean, I can think of, I've always been a lover of songs, and I have a real knack for like memorizing songs. So I guess that is a kind of poetry. But you've written several poetry books, right?
Right.
More than one.
Talk about something that gets taught out of you in school.
Yeah, seriously.
I mean, it is just deadly school. Because I mean, if your education was anything like mine, come English class and you'd read a poem, and the teacher would say, "So what do you think that means?" And there was the implication in their tone of voice was, "There's an answer to this. This is a code. Mm-hmm. This is a secret way of talking." And you'd say, "I think it's, you know, about a train." And they'd say, "Oh, that's very good, but no, that's not quite right."
Yeah, yeah.
And it was like, you know, it was a little bit like math, where, you know, there is an answer here if you work it out correctly. Poetry is, to me, you know, the pleasure people get in pop music is the same they ought to get out of poetry, which is, oh, this talks to me. I've been through this. This is what I've always wanted to say. Ideally, it's that, and it's open to the interpretation of anyone who hears it. There isn't a right answer for it, and it isn't scary. I think people are scared by poetry.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, both of those things are so true. I can remember, I only just now in the last few years have wanted to go back to a poem that I had to read. I was sort of made to read in high school I think it's called The Love Story or something like that of J. Alfred Prufrock. Did you ever read that poem?
Yeah,
and for some reason, the lines, I mean, like, this is coming down through the years, right? Like, I was about 15 when I read this poem, and the line that keeps coming in and out of my head is, "The women come and go," speaking of Michelangelo. Is that poem? And
that's
just...
T.S. Eliot.
That's right. It's T.S. And it's only now that I'm wondering, like, what does he mean by that? Like, in a way, because at the time I was so like, oh, God, stupid poetry, you know?
Right.
And it's really making me want to go back and read that. And I think as having kids, as a parent, I wasn't exposed to Where the Sidewalk Ends, like the Shel Silverstein book or any of the other books. And those are such a great gateway into poetry. And I can see in my kids, because they don't have this like, oh, it's poetry, so I'm not gonna. They don't have a kind of hood that comes down over their heads about it, and they are moved by poetry. I mean, my 10-year-old will come up to me and he'll say, "Oh, Mom, I just heard this really sad song that it turns out it's a Minecrafting song, but it's about a sad event that happens in Minecraft, and I feel like somebody dies or something, and he is really moved by this." And I feel like that's the essence of poetry. It doesn't matter like if it's about a dog or not, or a train. It's what do you get out of it? How does it make you feel? And
and I think lots and lots of kids are open to it until it gets closed off to them. In other words, whether it's a song or, it's just somebody who can say something so clearly and so beautifully that you're moved by it. That's like saying, that's a great looking tree over there. I like that tree. I want to say it's a natural reaction. I think it is for a lot of kids to think that language can be a cool thing.
Yeah, and playful. And
we get it turned off. But you should go back to Mr. Elliott. He's pretty good.
Yeah,
maybe you can turn it back on.
I agree. I think I will. I mean, and on that note, I know it's not a T.S. Eliot-like book, but I'd love it if you could share a little bit about your latest book, because it's a volume of poetry, right?
Yeah, a volume of poetry called The Names of Birds, and it is about just what it says it's about. It's sort of set up where you go out in the world and there is, it has to do with learning. There is all this science and knowledge and nomenclature for birds, and you go out and you see a red bird with a crest, and it looks beautiful, and you try to understand how you're sharing the world with it, and then eventually it comes to you that this is a cardinal, and that probably there's some information about this bird out there, and you find it. So the poems are really about perception and how you look at the natural world and learn about it and learn what other people have learned about it.
I feel like there's a kind of thread that runs through all the works that I've read, but even the ones that I've read about, that's like, what is our place in this world, whether that world is America as a nation or Asbury Park, New Jersey, or, out in nature looking at birds. Do you think that's true? Do you feel like there's a thread? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of us share that thread, which is, what are we doing here? What should we be doing to help other people and the world out? And you sort of figure from there, and whether it's, Asbury Park's a good example. Bruce Springsteen is why I got interested in Asbury Park. Mm-hmm. That was the poetry. I went, oh my God, what is this place he's yelling about? That sounds so cool.
Yeah.
And then I went to the place and decided, no, I can write a book about the history of this thing. I want to know more about it.
Yeah.
And that's, again, getting attracted by the beauty.
And it's what draws you, right? It's. If you think about it from the perspective of a child whose education is beginning, however we define that, what attracts them? What are they drawn to? And,
right.
And how can we foster that so that they end up doing what they love for their whole lives? Like I hope, like you have. It sounds like you have.
Yeah. I think that's a big part of it. I do want to say, so this doesn't sound like all sort of flowers and prettiness.
Yep.
But the flip side of that is you often have to fight pretty hard to get to the thing you want to do. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of forces, often in How Lincoln Learned to Read, it's school itself, which is saying to you, you really shouldn't be spending the time doing that. But it can be, politics, it can be social pressure, whatever it is, where, do you really want to write poetry? Don't you know that sissy stuff?
Yeah. You'll never make a living doing that. Yeah.
There's a lot of fight that gets you the space so you can pursue what you want. And I hope part of what I could do as a parent was to say to my kids, this isn't all going to be a bed of roses. You're going to have to fight to get the space to do the thing you want to do.
Yeah, yeah, and to have their parent as an ally in that fight, rather than having you saying, "Well, it's really better for you to learn your multiplication tables. They're going to take you further than writing poetry or whatever."
Right, yeah. It's a hard thing to do. Parenting is a hard thing to do.
Yep, yep. And I hope that I think a book like yours could help. could really help people kind of formulate in their own minds. Because I think before they go out into the world of like daycare providers and teachers and people who maybe don't have the same goals for your child as you do, or that your child necessarily does for him or herself, you know, for you to be able to say, well, all right, I'm looking at this situation and it's not in my kid's best interest. So how do I make it, you know, how can I shift it a little bit, or who can I work with, or whatever.
Right, exactly. So, how do you maneuver through it? Yeah,
exactly. Because it really is a journey. So, and you'll be in Boston in May doing some readings from the book. Are you going on like a tour?
Yeah, I'm going to be on the West Coast at the end of April and come back here and do Boston and New York and I know a couple other places.
Oh, that sounds cool. Is there a way that listeners could get in touch with you or find out about things like where you'll be on tour if they want to come and hear you read?
Sure. The publisher is called Four-Way Books, like a four-way stop.
Okay.
And Four-Way Books has a website that'll list all the events I'm going to be doing. It'll be through the fall anyway, probably in one way or another.
Cool.
I'd love people to come and say hello and say you heard about it here.
I will provide a link in the show notes to that. So if if people want to come out and meet Daniel Wolff and listen. And I think with that, we'd better